Thanks so much, Stephen. It's great to be here with you all. I just got in a couple hours ago. Was supposed to come yesterday, but Atlanta got about half an inch of snow, which shut down the entire city. People abandoning their cars on the side of the road. 600 flights canceled. But thankfully, I was able to get out today and come up to these tougher parts. Really thankful to be able to speak about this topic. Really encouraged that you all would come and give up an evening to talk about a question that I think is really significant. And I'm just going to start, if you don't mind, by reading to you a couple of ancient prayers. Just have a listen to these. I'm standing my ground, God, shouting for help. At my prayers every morning, on my knees each daybreak. Why, God, do you turn a deaf ear? Why do you make yourself absent? For as long as I remember, I've been hurting. I've taken the worst you can hand out, and I've had it. I'm bleeding, black and blue. The only friend I have left is darkness. I feel worn down. God, you have wasted me totally. You just stand there and let them do it. Let wicked people do what they want with me. Now my face is blotched red from weeping. Look at the dark shadows under my eyes, even though I've never hurt a soul and my prayers are sincere. I personally find it very encouraging that those prayers are in the Bible. In fact, those are the prayers of some of the heroes of the Bible. And one of the reasons that I've come to believe that I can trust the Christian faith and the Christian God amid suffering is because I don't think that it shies away from it. I think the Bible is honest and raw and real about suffering. And I just wanted to start, therefore, by encouraging you that if you're going through something that is grave in terms of the suffering, if you're going through something severe right now, and maybe you don't know if God is there or not, but all you can muster up in God's direction is frustration or even anger, that's okay. And that's not a sign of lack of faith. That's exactly what we find in the Bible. That's exactly at times the emotions that Jesus had as he dealt with the brokenness of this world. The Christian faith gives us the freedom, if we want to try to take our emotions about suffering directly to God, and they don't have to be a sign of a lack of faith. Now, I realize that a good number of you here tonight may not believe in God at all. That's closer to where I was when I started at college. I was skeptical that Christianity could have anything significant to say to this question or to other deep questions of life. I was challenged by some people to read through the Bible because I was making these claims, but I didn't actually know what the Bible said. I took them up on that challenge, but my intention was to disprove what it said, and I began to cross things out and to add things, and I'd write a big BS in the margin wherever I disagreed. And Christians would sort of look over my shoulder and say, Vince, why do you have a BS in the margin of your Bible? And I'd say, oh, that verse makes for a great Bible study. That's where I started. My attitude towards Christianity began to shift because as I was reading through the Bible, even though I still had big questions, I probably have more questions now than I did then, but I began to believe that Jesus lived the most beautiful life I had ever seen. I began to think that he was someone worth following. I began to believe that the Christian claims, as crazy as they initially seemed to me, could actually be intellectually defended. And I came to be aware of the fact, which I had no idea, that there were some incredibly bright scholars who were taking these claims very seriously and researching them with relentless rigor and still coming to the conclusion that Christianity was true. I began to believe that it could make sense up here in addition to down here. And I was studying philosophy at the time. That was very important to me. I was not willing to park my brain at the door. If Christian faith meant some blind leap of faith, then I knew that it wasn't for me. I still had big objections. The problem of evil was certainly one of them. How could there be a loving God if the world is so full of evil and suffering? And I think it's a fair question. God is all-powerful, therefore he should have enough power to stop suffering. God is all-loving, therefore he should desire to stop suffering. He's all-knowing, he should be intelligent enough to stop suffering, and yet We live in a world that's full of terrible brokenness and destruction and suffering. Now, if you or I stood by and we watched serious evil and suffering when we could stop it and we didn't, other people would rightly call us evil. So how then can I stand up here and call God loving? Okay, that question, that challenge is what's also often known as the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. Some of my first reflections on this question began with a conversation I had with my Aunt Regina. She shared with me about some of the suffering that her son Charles was experiencing and that she was experiencing because of some severe disabilities that Charles had. And in response, I began to spout some of my abstract philosophical explanations for why God might allow suffering. And my aunt listened to me very graciously, very patiently, and then she turned to me and she said, "But Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother." I've always tried to be slower to respond to this question since then. Okay, explanations were not what she needed at that time. And Jesus was better than I was at this. There's a point in the Bible where one of his good friends dies. He waits a couple of days when his friend is sick before he goes to see him. By the time he gets there, his friend Lazarus has died. And reading through the lines, Lazarus' sisters are not too impressed, and they're saying, "Jesus, why didn't you come earlier? If you had come earlier, our brother could still be alive. What do you have to say for yourself?" And Jesus was a lot smarter in that situation than I was. He knew that wasn't the time to try to give a defense or to give an explanation. Instead, what the text says is just that he wept. It says he wept in quite a dramatic way. And one of the most important things to me about my Christian faith is that I believe that I follow a God who wept real tears about the suffering of this world. So at the outset, I just want to recognize, in a room this big, there are going to be some people here who what you need tonight are not explanations and defenses. I'm going to do some of that, but that may not be where you're at. And if where you're at is you just need someone to hear what you're going through, maybe someone just to talk to, maybe someone to pray for you, we would count that a real honor, and we want to be there for that. And anybody who's in these maroon hoodies, I believe, are part of the team, and I'm sure would be very happy to come alongside you in that as well. If you're not a Christian here tonight and you're wearing a maroon hoodie, welcome to the team. I'm going to offer a few responses, and to find a first Christian response, I don't think there's one response that exhaustively does all the work, but to find a first Christian response to this challenging question, I think I need to say something about free will. The Bible starts with a story of people who were created free, because God didn't want to force people into relationship with him. He could have. He's powerful enough to just force us to do whatever he wants. He's powerful enough to just program us as robots so that we never do anything that displeases him or that causes any suffering or evil. But what do we call a relationship where the more powerful person forces the less powerful person to do whatever they want them to do? We tend to call that abuse. We tend to call that slavery. And that's not the way that you treat someone you love. I believe that God hates suffering. I don't think it's what he wants. But I also think that he's absolutely committed to not treating us as slaves. The Christian God is not a tyrant. Okay, a tyrant just wants obedience, doesn't care how he gets it. The Christian God is a father. That's distinctive about the Christian God. He's referred to as a father hundreds of times in the Bible. And a father wants his children to freely love him. But you're only free to love if you're also free to hate. You're only free to tell the truth if you're also free to lie. You're only free to help if you're also free to hurt. According to the Bible, the explanation of so much of the evil and the suffering that we see in the world is the misuse of the free will that God has given to us. Now, maybe you think that's an exaggeration, the idea that free will can have such stark consequences. I think perhaps I used to think this. I've come to think differently about it. And there was a specific moment where I came to think very differently about that. And that was when a boy named Ewan, who I used to fight with as a teenager, and I wasn't a very nice kid, and he wasn't a very nice kid, and I can remember taking every opportunity that I could to put him down. And I received word a few years ago that Ewan had taken his life. And there's a line in the Bible that says, the wages of sin is death. And I had read that hundreds of times. And it had never really hit me like it did when I heard that news. And I had to start asking certain questions of myself. Would he have made that decision if I had been kind to him? If I had used the very same free will that God had given me to help him up rather than to push him down? And I didn't know how to answer that question. Sometimes when I try to explain this Christian concept of sin, or this idea that we misuse our free will to people, they want to tell me that I'm exaggerating, that really I'm pretty good. It's not like I've killed anyone. And the reality is it's a lot harder for me to answer that question than you might think. And what if a light was shown not just on the rippling effects of my unkind words and unkind actions to Ewan, but on the rippling effects of all of my unkind words and actions? I think if we're going to be honest about this question, I think we need to be willing to ask that question, why suffering, not only of God, but also of ourselves and of the way that we use the free will that God has given us. We need to be humble enough to do that. And I always think of the way G.K. Chesterton responded when he was asked by a newspaper to respond to the question, what's wrong with the world? And he wrote in a very short article, it just said, "Dear sirs, I am sincerely yours, G.K. Chesterton." A second response. The next response I want to just glance towards starts with the following idea. We're not that smart. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of saying it. Sometimes I forget what I'm saying right in the middle of saying it. It's always a risky one, but I enjoy that moment where you think, are people going to laugh or are they not? Other times I forget to do the dishes within seconds of my wife telling me to. Here's the point. One of the assumptions that's smuggled into the thought that suffering disproves the existence of God is this. If God has good reasons for allowing suffering, we should expect to know what those reasons are. I want to question that. Why think that? An example, when I take my dog Buster to the vet, Buster doesn't understand why he has to get a painful needle so that he doesn't get a terrible disease. And even if I sit Buster down on the couch and I try to explain to him, it's really important for you to get this needle because if you don't get this needle, you won't be immune and you won't get this terrible disease, I don't get very far. And that's not because of some lack of ability on my part. It's not that I'm not a strong enough communicator or that I'm not trying to communicate that to Buster. Buster simply isn't the sort of being that can always understand all of my reasons for the things that I do. And you can think of other analogies. Parents with young children. Young children can't always understand all of the reasons that parents have for the things that they do. Well, if my ways are higher than my pet dog's ways, should we really be that surprised, if God exists, if some of his ways are beyond some of our ways? There's a large and growing philosophical literature on this idea. The technical name, if you want to look into it more deeply, the discussion gets very technical, and it's called skeptical theism, that response to the problem of evil. But it's not a new idea at its core. We find it in various places in the Bible. It says in Isaiah, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Or as God inquired of Job in the book of Job, he said, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know." Now, personally, my experience of universe creation is zero. And so I at least want to be cautious and not overly quick to think that I know more than God about how a universe should be created. I think that Pastor Tim Keller He's written a lot of very good books on some of these deep questions of faith and life. I think he puts this very well. He said, if you have a God great and transcendent enough to be mad at because he hasn't stopped evil and suffering in the world, then you have at the same moment a God great and transcendent enough to have good reasons for allowing it to continue that you can't know. Indeed, you can't have it both ways. Do we have a full understanding of why God allows all of the suffering he allows? No. But if God is as great and as beyond us as Christians would claim that he is, then isn't that exactly what we should expect to find? And if it's exactly what we should expect to find, if God does exist, then it can't be strong evidence that he doesn't exist. I have a couple more just brief sketches of responses that I'd like to share. And I'd like to do so by telling you a couple of my favorite stories. So first, a true story. My mom and dad met when they were teenagers. They both worked at the same supermarket. My mom as a cashier and my dad stocking the shelves. And my mom says she would call for price checks when she didn't need them so she'd get to flirt with my dad. She says he had great shoulders. Anyway, on their first date, my mom and dad went to a black tie event in New York City on New Year's Eve. There they are. And they fell in love. Then on their second date, they were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge. And my dad noticed a ring on my mom's finger. So he asked about it. And she said, oh, that's just some ring one of my old boyfriends gave to me. I just wear it because I think it looks nice. My dad said, oh, yeah, it is nice. Let me see it. So my mom took off the ring and handed it to my dad. And I like how some of you are already laughing because you see what's coming. I lived in England for 10 years, and the great thing was that in England, no one had any idea what was coming in this story because it was so beyond them that anyone would ever act this way. You tell this story in New York, like I barely started the story, and everybody's laughing. So mom hands the ring to my dad, and my dad hurls it off the bridge. He watches it sink to the bottom of the East River, and he says, you're with me now. You won't be needing that anymore. And my mom loved it. I think that was like the clinching moment for them. I'm telling you something about my family here. But what if she hadn't? Okay, what if my mom instead had concluded that, you know what? This guy has lost it. I better run off with the old boyfriend instead. What would that have meant for me? I want to try and connect this back in with this question of suffering. I think it's typical to think of the problem of suffering like this. We picture ourselves in this world with all of its suffering. Then we picture ourselves in a very different world with no suffering or with far less suffering. And then we say to ourselves, well, surely God should have made me in the other world, in the world with far less suffering or with no suffering at all. That's a reasonable thought. But I think we forget to ask an important question. Would it still be you and me as the individuals that we are in that very different world? And I think that's a tough question. You see, it was a pretty risky move my dad made when he hurled my mom's ring off the bridge. She loved it, but what if she hadn't? What if she had decided I better run back with the old boyfriend instead? Now, I don't know who the old boyfriend was. In fact, if you can believe it, 50 years later, my dad still tries to get my mom to tell him who the old boyfriend was who gave her that ring, and she still flatly refuses to say. I think she's like worried he's going to pay him a visit or something. Might not even be alive anymore. But it's about the right generation. What if we just say, just hypothetically, what if the old boyfriend had been Sylvester Stallone? Now, there would be some advantages if Sylvester Stallone had been my dad rather than my dad. For instance, I doubt I would have had to worry about being bullied at school if my dad was both Rocky and Rambo. However, not everything would have been great if Sylvester had been my dad rather than my actual dad. There's at least one significant problem here. If my mom had married the old boyfriend rather than my dad, I never would have existed. Maybe some other child would have existed, and maybe that child wouldn't have had to worry about being bullied at school. But part of what makes me who I am, the individual that I am, is my beginning. The parents I have, the combination of genes that's true of me, the specific sperm and egg cells that I came from. I'm sure my mom and her old boyfriend might have had some very nice kids, but I don't think that I would have been one of them. We often very understandably wish that we could take some piece of suffering out of this world while keeping everything else the same. But I don't think it works that way. If something as small as the throwing of a ring into a river can alter who comes to exist, imagine how much procreation history would be changed if God miraculously removed all vulnerability to suffering. Imagine if he stopped us every time we were going to use our free will to do something wrong. Imagine if he radically changed our natural environment, if weather systems or plate tectonics didn't behave as they did, if we were never susceptible to disease, if the laws of thermodynamics, if the natural laws had undergone some sort of redesign. What would be the results? And I think one likely result is that none of us would have lived. Sometimes we understandably wish for a very different world, but I think without realizing it or thinking it through, we actually wind up wishing ourselves right out of existence. And here's the important point that I want to connect to that. I don't think God likes that idea. In fact, I think one of the things that God values most about this world, even though I think he hates the evil and the suffering in it, is that it is a world that allowed for you and for me, and for the people that we love, and for every person we see walking down the street to come to exist. I believe he desired you and the person sitting next to you. Now, sometimes when I share that idea with people, people say, well, why me? Why us? Surely God could have gotten some more impressive beings. And it's a good question. It's a question that gets asked in the Bible. Psalm 8 says, what are mere mortals that you should think about them? What are human beings that you should even care for them? And I think there's a one-word answer to this question. It's an answer that's right at the center of what Christianity is about. It's my favorite word, and it's the word grace. It means unmerited love. The philosopher Robert Adams was my PhD advisor. He puts it this way. He says, grace is a disposition to love which is not dependent on the merit of the person loved. He says a gracious person sees what is valuable in the person he loves and does not worry about whether it is more or less valuable than what could be found in someone else he might have loved. I like that kind of love. Early on in our dating relationship, my wife Jo, at one point, she was a bit blinded by love, and she said, Vince, I don't deserve you. And I don't know where this came from, but I said, no, you don't. Bad move. And thankfully, I didn't stop there. I said, no, you don't, and I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? The best forms of love are not about what we earn or merit or deserve. How could you ever deserve another person as your very own? The best forms of love are about grace. They're unmerited. Love at its best is not based on what we earn. And I like that type of love. It means it's a type of love where you don't always have to be looking over your shoulder or around the corner wondering if somebody more worthy of love is going to come into the picture than you. You don't have to worry about that. It's a love that's secure. And therefore, it's a love that you can stop competing for and just begin to enjoy. If I had to summarize my experience of the Christian life in one sentence, one phrase, I might pick that one. That I was able to stop competing for love and begin to enjoy it. I wonder what your honest answer would be to that question. Do you compete for love? Or do you enjoy it? What if even before the creation of the universe, God loved us with grace, with love that is a gift, with love that is exactly the same on your very best day and on your very worst day. With the love of a parent standing over a newborn child, that child can't do anything to earn the parent's love, and yet that love could not be more extravagant. The question, why do you love your child? It doesn't even make sense to the parent. What do you mean, why do I love my child? That's my child. I created the child. The child's in my image, has my nose. That type of love. Love that's not meant to be earned, but simply to be returned. What if God loves us like that? My family has had quite a bit of disability in it, and the result of that has been quite a bit of suffering. Now, some people would say it would have been better if my cousin Charles, who I referenced at the beginning of this talk, my Aunt Regina's son, it would have been better if my cousin Charles had never existed. After all, there would have been less suffering in the world overall. The world would have been better off. Okay, I strongly disagree with that statement. It's because I knew Charles so intimately, like my Aunt Regina, that his suffering was so frustrating. But it's also because I knew Charles so intimately that I could understand why God would love him so much and why God might be interested in a world that would allow for him to come to exist and for him to be invited into relationship with God for all eternity. And so the problem of suffering, following from all that I've said, it's reframed, I think, in the form of a question. This question: could God have wronged us by creating a world in which we came to exist and are offered eternal life, rather than creating a very different world in which we never would have lived? There's a strong analogy here between divine creation on the one hand and human procreation, having a child, on the other hand. The decision of parents to have a child is a very sobering decision. We don't usually think of it that way, and understandably so. We want to focus on the hopeful and positive aspects of having a child. But there is a reality to the fact that anyone who decides to have a child risks great suffering. In fact, even more than that, they know full well that any child they have will undergo serious suffering, because even the most fortunate of human lives includes serious suffering. And even more than that, they know that one day that child will experience death itself. I know that's a very difficult thought. I don't even like communicating those words. But I think it does suggest that this challenge from suffering, it's more complicated than it first appears. If someone thinks it would be evil to create people into a world that you know will produce serious suffering in their lives, if you agree with that statement, which I have to admit, when I look at it, initially it seems pretty reasonable. But if you agree with that statement, you will not only have to call God evil, you will also have to call evil anyone who decides to have a child. And I think it's interesting how quick we sometimes are to look up and to blame God for our suffering. I'm so thankful to worship a God who came down into our suffering. And actually, when he hung on a cross, he looked at the very people who were causing his suffering. And the instinctive words out of his mouth were, "Father, forgive them." And return to my parents' story for the next portion of this talk. So they got together, not the old boyfriend, my dad. They decided to have a child. They had me. But they also had to consider what it was going to cost them to have me and to raise me. Love requires sacrifice. My parents had me, and then they sacrificed, as many parents do, countless hours of sleep to care for me. I wouldn't go to sleep when I was small unless I was holding my mom's hand. And so rather than do what you probably should do, and just let me cry it out for a couple nights and it'd be okay, my mom pulled a mattress into my room and slept like night after night with her hand uncomfortably stretched up into my crib. Eventually, we got past that stage. That wasn't a joke. And then I was about 6 years old. This is maybe my favorite story from my childhood, but I was about 6 years old. I was playing football on my my next door neighbor's front lawn, and I was getting knocked around pretty good. I was playing with some older kids, and I started crying, and I came running home to my mom, who was on the front porch, and I was saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. There's Mom on the front porch where this happened. She's sporting the classic 80s onesie. And I come running up to her, and I'm crying, and I'm saying, I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough. So guess what my mom did? My mom did what any loving mother of a 6-year-old son would do, who was crying. She positioned herself like this. She got down in quite a sort of athletic stance. And she hung her nose out in the air, and she looked at me lovingly, and then she said, punch me in the nose. She said, you are tough enough. Punch me in the nose. I know what you're thinking, crazy Italians. And indeed, like I thought she was crazy, but she persisted. You know, she continued to say, punch me in the nose, punch me in the nose. And I don't know what sort of psychological state I must have been in, but finally I did. Later on, I took up boxing, and maybe there was a connection here. But finally, I did. I reared back as a 6-year-old, and I'm not recommending this in any way, but there's a point to make from it. And I gave my mom a straight right hand to the nose. And to my astonishment, and to her astonishment, blood actually began to come out of my mom's nose and to drip down her face. How is this relevant to the problem of suffering? We're going to bring it back. Then came the most vivid image from my childhood. Through this blood that was dripping down my mom's face came the most gorgeous, just radiant, joyful smile. And my mom said, now get back out there. And my mom sent me back out to that game, and she went inside to get cleaned up. My mom chose to bring me into this world. And when she did, she knew that there would be suffering. But that in itself did not make her evil. Why? Because when the suffering came, she did something. Unthinkable, yes. Messy, yes. Bloody. But also an extravagant display of love. When that suffering came, she bent down and she stepped into that suffering with me. And that, for me, is a picture of Jesus. Where, yes, God created a universe. And yes, it wound up being a universe that had significant suffering. But he did not stay far away. He did something unthinkable, messy, bloody, but also an extravagant display of love. That he stepped down into our suffering. And he suffered with us. That's why I believe that I can trust him. The atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche may have been the one who said it best. He said, the gods justified human life by living it themselves, the only satisfactory response to the problem of suffering ever invented. Nietzsche is actually talking about the ancient Greeks here, and he never seems to make the connection to Christianity, but I think the connection is clear. The night before Jesus died, he knew what was coming. And as he wrestled with what the next day would bring, the Bible says that he says to his friends, my heart is sorrowful, even to death. Think about that. The God of the universe, the creator of all things, saying that his heart is sorrowful, even to death. If you've ever experienced deep depression, if you've ever thought about suicide, no matter what it is that you've been through, there's no depth of agony or helplessness that you could experience in this life that Jesus doesn't understand. The loving parent, I don't think, is the one who never allows suffering in the life of a child. The loving parent is the one who is willing to come alongside a child in their suffering. The loving parent is the one who's willing to make a personal sacrifice, if that's what it takes, to come alongside the child's suffering and ultimately to see them through it. And I think that is exactly what the Christian God has done. So far, I've been considering whether God can be loving despite the suffering in the world. But as I start to draw to a close, I want to mention that that's not the only problem of suffering. There's also the problem of how we're going to deal with suffering. And that's a problem for every one of us, okay, regardless of what we do or don't believe about God. My cousin Charles died a number of years ago. He went to dinner with my Aunt Regina. He started choking on a piece of chicken, and he stopped breathing, and they couldn't get him to start breathing again, and that was it. And without God, what could be more senseless? And I found myself thinking at that time, without God, what could I possibly say to my Aunt Regina? I genuinely believe that Christianity offers a real and tangible hope, even in a situation like that. 2 years ago, one of my students, her name is Ariel, brilliant young woman, and she got a diagnosis, healthy, a sportsman, and she got a diagnosis that her brain is prone to bleeding and that she would probably only live for a few more years. And a couple of days after she got that diagnosis, she came and she spoke to her classmates and to her teachers as well. And she shared 3 things with us from her Christian faith. She said, first, God has good plans for my life, and I don't believe that He will take me, that He will let my life end until those plans have been accomplished. She said, secondly, Jesus knew what it was to only have a couple of years left. And yet He could say, my time has not yet come, and He could live every day to the full. And that's what I plan to do. And then she said, and even though now it's more real and it's more present to me that my body is weak and that I could die at any time, the reality is that's exactly the same, she said, for every one of us. And then she challenged us with a very tough question. She said, are you living today the way you would want to be living if tomorrow is the day where you'll see God face to face? A few days later, Ariel shared with me that there came a moment when she was looking in the mirror and she was testing the limited mobility that she now had on her right side. And the questions that jumped into her mind were, is this the strongest I'm ever going to be? Is this the healthiest I'm ever going to be? Is this the prettiest that I'm ever going to be? And then she shared with me the overwhelming peace that came over her as she remembered the answers to those questions. No, absolutely not. And I remembered in that moment that Ariel loves to snowboard. And so I said to her, do you think there'll be snowboarding in heaven? And I wish you could have seen how unhesitatingly and how confidently she responded, absolutely, and soccer too. Some people think that the problem of suffering should push us away from God. I think for me, it's precisely the problem of suffering that pushes me toward God, because God alone is the one who can do something about it. Okay, I believe that before time, God chose my cousin Charles because He desired for him to come to exist and because He loved him and He wanted to invite him into a relationship with Himself. I believe that in time, God was willing to come down and suffer alongside Charles so that he could be comforted and have the courage to go through it. And I believe at the end of time, God ultimately will set things right. I think he will set things right in a place that's described as where there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, because God himself will wipe away the tears. There's that wonderful detail of intimacy there right at the beginning. He will wipe every tear. Talking about God himself. That's a literal, physical statement that God himself will wipe every tear. He's been through it with us. He'll be there in the end to wipe the tears and to usher us into a place where there will be no more mourning or death or crying or pain. He loved us in the beginning. He loved us in time, and he loved us in the end. That's why I believe I can trust the Christian God even amidst the suffering of this world. I shared with you earlier that my conception of God used to be so different. When I showed up at college, one, I thought if God even existed, he was distant. What could he care? How could he care at all about the details of my life? And secondly, that if he was there, what he cared about was whether I could earn his favor, whether I could do enough to be right in his sight. I'm so grateful that I took that challenge to actually read the Bible, to explore the Christian message, to ask difficult questions of Christians who were willing to answer them, and to see God for who he is. The furthest thing from distant, but somebody who came down when he didn't have to, because he wanted to live life beside us, even though that meant his suffering and his death. And not a God that in any way asks us to work our way up to him, the exact opposite, a God who came down to find us. The incredible thing that I learned as I explored the Christian faith was that what it meant to be a Christian and to step into that relationship with God wasn't that I had to spend the rest of my life trying to do more good than bad and hope that at the end of the day that the scales would tip in my favor. This was a loving parent just longing for his child to just turn back in his direction so that he could run to him and embrace him and welcome him home. And all he wanted was for me to humble myself and just say, I'm sorry for the things I've done wrong. And to say, thank you, Jesus, for coming when you didn't have to, for suffering when you didn't have to, for being willing even to die in order to be close to me when you didn't have to. And then just to say, will you please come into my life? And can we do this life together, step by step, day by day? Will you show me what it means to live the life that ultimately you created me for? I was just delighted that that is the message of Christianity, and it's one that I believe can hold up both here and here. Maybe there are people who have been journeying through this week, and you had a different conception of what Christianity was and who the Christian God was. But tonight you're saying, if that's who the Christian God is, and if that invitation is on the table, then I want to say yes to God, just like he's already said yes to you. And there may be some people tonight who are in that place. And if it's all right, I just want to offer a brief prayer. And anybody who feels like, yeah, that's where I'm at. I want to start this relationship with God. Like I said, that does not mean you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and all your questions are going to be answered. Any more than I woke up the day after getting married and all my questions about women or about my wife were answered. But it means that you've made a significant choice to step into a relationship and to take that relationship seriously in the days ahead. Let me pray a prayer that would do that. And if that's where you are, feel free to just pray this quietly in your heart as well. Well, Jesus, I want to thank you that you're who you are. And thank you that you are so loving and so committed to every person in this room that it's easy to stand up here and talk about you and invite people to say yes to a relationship with you. Thank you that every single person in this room you longed for, you desired before they were ever born. And you came and you suffered on this earth so that you could truly understand anything that they're going through. And thank you that you have a plan for a future which will be far better. Tonight, along with anyone in the room who wants to say this to you, I just want to say I'm sorry. There are many times where I have not lived up to the life that you intended for me. There are times when I have turned my back on you. There are times when I have said no to truth, times when I have said no to love. And I want to say I'm sorry and ask for your forgiveness. And Jesus, I want to say thank you tonight. I recognize that as God himself, you didn't have to do what you did. You humbled yourself. You're born as a baby. You lived a life of human suffering. You died a terrible death. And you did that so that the consequences of my sin would be on you and not on me. What an extravagant gift of love, and I thank you for it. And I want to say, please, Jesus, please come into my life. I want to start that relationship with you. And I pray that even tomorrow as I awake, I would have a sense of your presence and a sense of expectancy and excitement as together we move towards the great plans and purposes in life that you had in mind for me from the very beginning. God, I thank you for all those things, and I pray in Jesus' name, amen.